Chapter 13 Fun with a Stranger, 1970 to 1974. A Special Providence sold fewer than 7,000 copies and left Yates to Knopf for almost $13,000. Dell paid only $2,500 for the paperback rights and made it clear they weren't hopeful for a large sale. But you must not brood over this, wrote Monica McCall. It will simply be up to me to get you a sufficient advance from Bob on the new book. Meanwhile, Dell was considering a new edition of Revolutionary Road, out of print by then, for their contemporary classics line, so that was a comfort. Footnote: Sam Lawrence, whose imprint was then a Dell, had nothing to do with these transactions. Nor was it only this sign that Yates wasn't entirely forgotten as a force in American literature. That spring, he was approached by Boston University, whose representatives were most desirous of establishing the Richard Yates collection, as they were certain future scholars would be studying his life and work. Yates was happy to oblige with whatever papers he had, though he regretted to inform them that he'd already lost all working drafts of his latest novel, A Special Providence. It had taken Yates almost 14 years to produce his first two novels, and now that he faced the added disadvantage of being middle-aged and tired, he doubted that his output would increase. As fame and fortune had ceased to be imminent prospects, Yates was ready at last to commit himself to teaching as a career. "I've sort of decided I like Iowa after all," he wrote a friend, "which I never thought would happen. I guess what it amounts to is that I proved I can't make a living in Hollywood or New York without scrambling my brains, which leaves the groves of academe as the only reasonable alternative, and these particular groves are the only ones I know." As jaded as Yates remained on the subject of teaching writing, the truth was he rather enjoyed it. His students brought out the best in him: modesty, candor, generosity, and more than ever he needed their admiration. Unfortunately, it was almost impossible for Yates to write and teach at the same time, since both require the same kind of energy. But such was also the case with every other kind of wage slavery he'd tried. And meanwhile, a man and his family had to eat. Now that he was married and settled, Yates wanted the security of tenure as well. He was now in his 5th year at Iowa and still only a lecturer with an annual salary of $12,000, which he bitterly attributed to his lack of an academic degree. In fact, tenure was rarely awarded to workshop faculty, since a brisk turnover was regarded as desirable for any number of reasons, not the least being that many writers were prone to burnout and proved to be mediocre teachers besides. But whatever else one could say of Yates, he wasn't mediocre, and his friend George Starbuck had recommended him for tenure before resigning as director at the end of the 1968-69 academic year. In the fall, Yates's promotion was passed by the executive committee of the English department as well as the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, but his final appointment had yet to be approved. Meanwhile, a writer and Houghton Mifflin editor, Jack Leggett, was brought in from Boston to serve as temporary director of the workshop, and he promptly invited Yates to dinner and vice versa. Leggett was an affable man who knew of Yates through their mutual friend Sam Lawrence, and Yates assumed he'd be an ally. Frankly and rather tipsily, Yates confided his frustration over the tenure question. He'd been given to understand that approval was little more than a formality at this point, but as time dragged on, he'd begun to suspect that Paul Engel had it in for him. Engel had retired as director a few years ago when the workshop was absorbed by the English department, but he still exerted considerable influence behind the scenes, and Yates thought he looked like a man slinking around with a secret. In any case, Yates hoped that Leggett would fix the matter as soon as possible. Leggett remained affably noncommittal. Yates's suspicions were not idle paranoia. Though Paul Engel was regarded as a kind of benignant Carl Sandburg figure, he could be ruthless in protecting the interests of the workshop. His own brainchild, after all, and that meant weeding out undesirables. Engel had attended Yates's wedding to Martha, and the men were cordial, if not close. Privately, though, Engel had always had qualms. During Yates's first sodden year at Iowa, he'd been protected by the formidable Kissel, who thought the vagaries of writers, and Yates in particular, should be pardoned as part of the psychic territory. To some extent, Engel agreed, but at the same time he recognized the need for diplomatic restraint on the part of teachers and students alike, lest the workshop's dubious reputation in the community suffer Further, probably Yates's 1967 breakdown, what with all the odd behavior that attended it, had sealed his fate as far as Engel was concerned. After Cassell's departure, Yates still had influential friends such as Borgelli and Starbuck, but the latter was gone now too, and other poets on the faculty were not so well disposed. While Yates was careful not to insult colleagues to their faces, he was rather infamous for regarding poets with disdain. As Robin Metz explained, poets were open to a kind of effete sensibility, still affected by the modernist idea that they were an academic priesthood, and they engaged in the sort of esoteric literary talk that always intimidated and angered Dick. He thought they put on pretentious airs while prose writers were foot soldiers doing an honest and difficult job. Ultimately, though, the poet whose opinion mattered most was Engel, and whether or not he was aware of Yates's aesthetic prejudices was probably beside the point. When he learned that someone so unbalanced was about to get tenure, he took immediate action. Engel let it be known in a whispered way that I had to get rid of Yates, Liggett recalled. This guy does not have tenure, he said, otherwise we'll never get rid of him, etc., etc. I was the cop sergeant getting orders from above, and English Chairman Gerber must have concurred with Engel, since I wouldn't have done anything without his order. Liggett also remembered being approached that year by some of Yates's students, who loved Dick but thought he was too sick to be teaching. Apparently, Yates had missed a few classes and begun behaving erratically again. Martha, however, claims that his mental health and drinking were more or less under control at the time, and as far as she knew, he never missed another class after his breakdown 3 years before. The fact remained that Yates had been promised tenure, that he desperately needed the security to go on with his writing, and nobody wanted to break the news to him. Liggett noticed how Yates seemed to grow hostile as he began to suspect the deception, but the year passed and nobody said another straightforward word on the subject to Yates. They waited until he'd left town in June to attend the Holland's Writing Conference in Virginia, an occasion Yates might have enjoyed under other circumstances. Organized by writer-in-residence George Garrett, the 2-week conference turned into an almost legendary debauch, featuring some of the leading lights of American literature, for whose services Garrett had paid upward of $5,000 a head. Ralph Ellison, Styron, Peter Taylor, James Dickey, and some 50 others. They turned the dorms into Dodge City, said Garrett, swimming in the nude, drinking all night. Dickey came to town with a blonde hooker from Miami, and the couple appeared in the Holland's alumni magazine as Mr. and Mrs. Dickey. Amid the fun, Yates somberly attended to his duties and got quietly stewed at night. Martha seemed a nurse, the writer Bill Harrison observed. She propped Dick up and sat stroking his arm. My wife would just look at her and shake her head. Yates needed the nursing. He'd received a letter on arrival, CO, the Holland's Writing Conference, signed by his Iowa colleague Bill Murray, who sheepishly identified himself as acting director in the summertime absence of those from whom he was taking orders. A problem has come up regarding your appointment to associate professor. The administration questioned it on 2 grounds. The usual ladder of promotion is from lecturer to assistant professor. Vance was promoted in this way. They also questioned the validity of making a tenured appointment when the workshop has no director. You know, of course, that the initial proposal for your promotion passed the executive committee of the department and through the dean of the College of Liberal Arts as well. The question came from the provost of the university. John Gerber called a special meeting of the executive committee, and it was decided to recommend your promotion to assistant rather than associate professor. The assistant professorship is a 3-year appointment renewable. Though the promotion now is to assistant professor, your salary will be that promised you as associate professor. Yates was devastated, as much by the cowardice and petty chicanery of it all. The question came from the provost of the university. as by the professional consequences to himself. Back in Iowa, he made a beeline for Leggett's office and stood glowering in the doorway while the man let him know, affably as ever, that he hadn't written a recommendation for Yates's tenure, and now, well, he didn't see how he could. That told Dick all he needed to know, said Leggett. It was time for him to fish or cut bait. Yates had no desire to accept the guilty sop of an assistant professorship, but as it turned out, he'd be stuck at Iowa for another disgruntled year while he hunted for a job, any job, with a somewhat comparable salary. He even wrote to his old friend Hayes Jacobs at the new school, who jovially replied that he could get Yates as much as $800 for a 15-week term, which was more than 80% of the writing faculty were paid. Yates kept looking. He didn't want to spend a day more in Iowa City than strictly necessary, and much of that summer was spent traveling. For a long time, he'd been eager to get started on a novel about a man who goes progressively irredeemably crazy, and for the sake of mnemonic atmosphere, he returned to the sites of his own breakdowns. For a month or so, he and Martha lived in the same raffish part of Hollywood, raffish, where Yates had been arrested while emptying his wallet on Sunset Boulevard. Such research had a less than salutary effect on his morale, though he was careful not to drink too much and invite a sequel to the summer of 1965. Meanwhile, Brian Moore rallied around with a party or two in the Yateses' honor. Martha observed that her husband's Hollywood friends seemed relieved that someone was taking care of him, though Joan Didion was chilly toward her, and apparently Didion wasn't the only one. Years later, long after his second marriage was over, Yates was still grumbling about how certain Hollywood writers had been rude to his wife, though Martha wasn't particularly bothered one way or the other. That's just the way it was. For Yates, though, it was further proof of the corrupting influence of the place. After a teaching visit to Central Oregon Community College, the Yateses spent a week at Bill Kittredge's home in Missoula, Montana. Yates's old roughneck buddies Bob Lacey and Jim Crumley were on hand, and the reunion was a festive respite in the midst of a trying summer. Despite the rowdiness of the younger set, Yates was adamant about sticking to his sensible drinking regime for Martha's sake. Dick waited until the cocktail hour, said Kittredge, but around 4:30 he'd start pacing through the house, straightening pictures and checking the thermostat. As it happened, the visit was the last Kittredge ever saw of his old teacher, except for the sad eyes that sometimes appeared whenever he lapsed into tricky prose. Yates continued his research in New York, lurking around Bellevue and St. Vincent and various old haunts in the village. Memories of his tormented second bachelorhood mingled with a sense of unfulfilled literary promise left him depressed and on edge. Bob Reich was struck by the change in Yates when the two met at Warren and Marjorie Owens's house in Bethel, Connecticut. As Reich remembered, Dick used to be so funny, but no more. Just to be provocative, I mentioned a few post-realist authors like Barth, and Martha took me aside and said, "Please don't get him upset." Warren Owens also noticed Martha's tendency to cringe at her husband's outbursts, and later she unhappily confided that she'd been having problems calming him down. Most of the night's discussion was political. One of the guests, Penny Miller, was the wife of a CBS correspondent who'd recently been killed in Vietnam, and Yates was alternately consoling and volatile in his ranting against the war, incited somewhat perhaps by Reich's competitive tendency to remind the room that he himself was not merely radical but revolutionary. I recall trying to say a good many loud and raucous things on all sides, Yates wrote afterward, and finally spoiling the whole party by puking my guts out into what I believe was a very nice toilet bowl. Yeah, drunk again. But the night had piqued Yates into thinking about the past, his own generation's political convictions, and on the plane back to Iowa, he began to consider a rather peculiar nonfiction project. All the more alluring, perhaps, because his new novel had left him blocked and haunted, and he was eager to put it aside. And perhaps, too, because he was tempted to prove he could be as relevant as the next writer. That fall, anyway, Yates appeared at a public reading in Iowa with 2 manila envelopes under his arm, one marked Disturbing the Peace, and the other Veterans. He told the audience he wasn't willing to read from either, but would answer questions, most of which were in regard to the latter. As Yeats subsequently described veterans to the man whom it most concerned, the book might be in the form of one long letter, or possibly a series of letters to an old friend, John A. Williams. He went on, "But there has been a lot of veteranship between you and me. Combat service in WW2, early marriages that didn't work, touch football, boozing, and meeting famous writers at Breadloaf. The many times you tried to explain different kinds of jazz to me. Those phone calls between us when Ed Wallant was dying, the time I woke you up and made you listen to the Kennedy Civil Rights Address that never got delivered, the time you stayed in my Washington, D.C. apartment during your holiday magazine trip, and much, much more." Who knows where this bizarre career move would have taken Yates? This impulse to rebut the radical youth of Iowa, who, he noted sardonically, were on the march. "One of the more bewildered undergraduates is my older daughter, Sharon. Had it not been for John Williams's intrigued but rather barbed reply." Among other things, Williams remembered that their first conversation at Breadloaf in 1960 had concerned what Yates allegedly called the mediocre record of black soldiers in World War II. Williams then proceeded to confess his irritation over being used as a sounding board for Yates's civil rights speeches in 1963. It took Yates many months to regain his composure, and finally he wrote a measured but seething response. Their first conversation, he amended, was not at all as Williams described it, but rather about the hideous whim of the federal government that consigned virtually all Army blacks to rear echelon service and support duty. What angered Yates most, though, was his old friend's belated frankness about the speechwriting episode. "I guess all this just goes to show how many secrets lie under the surface of any friendship," Yates concluded, "but it tends to make my veterans book a much harder piece of work than I thought it was going to be, and so I have temporarily shelved it." Temporarily soon became forever, and apparently neither Veterans nor any other nonfiction book, relevant or otherwise, was undertaken again. Perhaps it was for the best. Such diversions seemed the baffled groping of a lost man. But that fall, he was summoned back to the true path. He'd been sore as hell when Revolutionary Road first went out of print. Do you know what being out of print is like? It's like being dead. But now Dell was preparing a new paperback edition for the lucrative college market. Moreover, his famous friend Vonnegut had provided a blurb in which he called the novel the Great Gatsby of its time. "All the time I praise books I don't give a shit about," he wrote Yates. "This is a sickness of mine. I thank you for the opportunity to do something healthy for a change, to boom one of the best books of our generation." And finally, Fred Chappell's rueful vindication of the novel was published that April, a month after the Dell edition, in a volume titled Rediscoveries. Martha seized the moment to her husband with a rebirth announcement, mailed to friends. "Revolutionary Road is back in print now. Richard Yates Club International, Martha Yates President." And by the end of that last, otherwise uneventful year at the workshop, Yates was able to write that he was deep into his new novel and working with qualified optimism. It was a start. Yates was sufficiently eager to leave Iowa that he decided to accept a job as Distinguished Writer in Residence at Wichita State University, though he had to do a certain amount of soul-searching first. Jack Leggett had assured him that his 3-year term as assistant professor would remain intact no matter what, so really there was no hurry to settle for a venue like Kansas, which seemed the quintessence of what Vonnegut called up the river. On the other hand, the salary was decent, $16,000 a year, and Martha was in favor of living closer to her family. Nor was he likely to get a better offer. The fact was, even in the darker plain states, Yates's drinking and odd behavior had become all but proverbial. Indeed, had been much discussed in advance at Wichita State, where the head of the writing program, Bruce Cutler, was a former workshop student of Yates. "There's a great deal of interest among the students here in your arrival," Cutler wrote his old teacher, on whom he'd promised to keep an eye. At any rate, it was only a temporary appointment, renewable or not at the end of the year, whereupon Yates could always return temporarily to Iowa. Moving out of the stone cottage was a melancholy business. Yates was fond of the drafty old conversation piece, where he'd hoped to settle for however long it took to write the novel that would end his teaching days forever. But then he was hardly one to become overly attached to or even much conscious of wherever he happened to dwell. And after a big garage sale, they moved in August to a suburban tract house in Wichita. The place was soulless, though Yates was impressed by its efficient, no nonsense modernity, and he went right to work in climate controlled comfort without any more picturesque distractions. Things got off to a good start. Yates was promptly interviewed by the local newspaper, and a flattering article with a photo of both Yateses followed. Also, he was pleased to find that he had two or three students who gave hints of talent and were good occasional companions as well. He felt as if he'd landed on his feet, more or less, and was careful to keep his balance. He stuck to his sensible drinking regime, avoided faculty parties, met his classes on time, and got his work done. One drawback was that Martha's life was duller than usual, and with whatever misgivings she decided it was time to have a baby. Yates saw her point, and within a month of their arrival she was pregnant. With another child on the way, the long-term prospect of ill-paying academia, whether in Wichita or Iowa City or whatever god-forsaken place he landed, looked grimmer than ever, such that he was even willing to consider Hollywood again. In October, he asked McCall to find out whether Al Reddy would hire him to write a screenplay adaptation for Revolutionary Road. McCall urged him to dream up an original screenplay if possible, since material in this form is more easily saleable than in the novel or play form. Meanwhile, Ruddy claimed he was still interested in making a movie out of Yates's novel, but already had two projects lined up after The Godfather. He did tell McCall that it would break his heart for another person to produce Revolutionary Road, though if someone made him an irresistible offer, he wouldn't stand in the way. But nobody did, and Ruddy kept busy with other things, and Yates just decided to forgo original screenplay. And Yates decided to forgo original screenwriting and get back to work on Disturbing the Peace, in something of a middle by the end of November. That spring, Yates scheduled back-to-back readings at the University of Arkansas and Roger Williams College in Rhode Island. Clearly, geographical convenience was not the guiding principle. During 3 years of marriage, he and Martha had rarely been apart, and except for the odd lapse, Yates had been on his best behavior. But with a baby due in June and his financial future uncertain as ever, the Easter break would be his last chance to go on a quick, cathartic bender in congenial company, namely with old friends and/or students such as Miller Williams, Jim Whitehead, and Bill Harrison in Arkansas, and Jeffrey Clark, DeWitt Henry, and the Cassells in Rhode Island. Martha spent the time with her family in Kansas City. The Arkansas part of the junket remained something of a blur to all concerned. Yates put in a few workshop appearances and gave a reading, after which he got over-the-top drunk at Bill Harrison's house and passed out on the floor. Students stepped over his body on the way out, Harrison recalled. Rhode Island was somewhat more memorable, though hardly more sober. Yates's host, Geoffrey Clark, was a devoted protege who introduced Yates to his students as the best teacher I ever had. Footnote. Clark was kind enough to send me a tape of Yates's reading Dr. Jack-o'-lantern from this visit, the only time I've ever heard Yates's voice, sonorous, doleful, with a barely perceptible lisp. He sounds to me like a rather less jaunty version of the actor Donald Sutherland. By all accounts, when in good form, Yates relished the opportunity to read for a receptive audience. On the tape, his imitation of Vincent Sabella's New York accent earns him a well-deserved burst of laughter, and the final applause is properly enthusiastic. "Say, Joff, tell me the truth," Yates later asked him. "Did you really mean that about being the best teacher you ever had? Are you kidding me?" Clark assured him he was not, and Yates's face broke into a shy, pleased smile, as Clark described it, a Gatsby smile. Yates was less pleased when he skimmed through his ex-student's teaching copy of Revolutionary Road and encountered the marginal gloss use of cliché. Yates seemed to recoil from it as from a hot poker. Clark recalled, then go glum until my explanation. The note was a reminder to me to point out to my class how he'd use spoken cliches to capture the character of the speaker. The main item on the agenda was an interview for the journal Plowshares, which DeWitt Henry had founded in Boston the year before as a corrective to the tide of experimental postmodernism sweeping the country. The interview was a chance for Yates to discuss the principles of traditional fiction in terms of his own work, as well as to recommend a number of other writers who were in danger of being overlooked amid present trends. The published interview is perhaps the most useful source of Yates's opinion on his craft and career, as well as the most vivid record of his distinctively candid yet diffident voice, all of which is a bit remarkable given that the actual interview was something of a fiasco and had to be rewritten almost from scratch. Henry had driven down from Boston with two Plowshares associates, David Omar White and Peter O'Malley, as well as the latter's fiancée, the poet Richard Wilbur's daughter Ellen. The interview was taped over the course of several boozy hours at Clark's house, and the interviewee was besotted in more ways than one, flirting blatantly with that luscious Wilbur girl, as he called her. I felt like a teeny bopper because I admired Revolutionary Road so much, Wilbur remembered. But I was also alarmed. I told Yates he had the most brutal eye for human flaws of any writer, and it frightened me to think he was casting the same eye right now on me. Yates was flattered, and when Wilbur further confessed a kindred fondness for Cole Porter and Gershwin, he became enthralled. When she wondered if he could supply a forgotten line from a favorite song, his face lit up at the challenge. "You're the cream in my coffee," she prompted. "You're the lamb in my stew," he crowed, and the two proceeded to sing the rest. Wilbur's fiancée grew increasingly glum as Yates implied that such an elegant woman deserved better. "I seem to recall being not very nice to that Irish clown," Yates wrote afterward. And finally, they all adjourned to Howard Johnson's, where Kissel, then at Brown University, met them in order to take his worse-for-wear guest home for the night. Alas, amid all the boozing and bullshit, as Yates put it, he'd totally failed to apologize to DeWitt for having flubbed his interview. Indeed, Henry found his transcription fragmentary, diffuse, and frustrating, but hoped the subject would agree to expand and clarify in written form, and this Yates was happy to do. There was another less festive bit of business in the East. David Milch had returned to Yale to teach alongside his old mentors Robert Penn Warren and Cleanth Brooks, and had recently intimated that he might be able to arrange a writer-in-residence job for Yates. The latter's distaste at assuming the role of supplicant vis-a-vis an old bête noire like Milch can scarcely be conceived, or rather it can, since it wouldn't be the last time it happened. But at the time, he was simply too desperate not to pursue the lead, however specious. More than ever, Yates wanted to end his exile in the sticks and to live in or around New York again. Also, he'd prefer to say he taught at Yale rather than Wichita State. Yates visited Milch's seminar a few times that spring and summer as a guest lecturer, and though he was visibly cowed by the dreadful ambience of the Ivy League, he acquitted himself well enough for Milch to report somewhat plausibly that chances were very good he'd be hired. Milch had broached the matter with the author of All the King's Men, whose reaction was very favorable, as was that of Cleanth Brooks. He added, however, that Brooks was angling for Walker Percy, though Percy's health was such that he seemed reluctant to come north. Nothing came of it. "Maybe I didn't follow through," said Milch, or maybe Dick gave the impression he was having a lot of problems. Whatever the case, Milch concedes his ambivalence towards Yates in those days. "Probably I didn't go out of my way to put Dick at ease, inviting him in but not letting him know he was in. That was the kind of asshole I was at the time." Gina Catherine was born on June 15, 1972, more than 15 years after Yates's previous child. Her belated advent seemed to promise that Yates, if he played his cards right, would have the comfort of a doting girl for the rest of his life, and thus was cause for great rejoicing. "She's lovely," he wrote friends, "looks just like her mother." Her namesake, Gina Beralt, who had finally met Yates in the flesh while teaching at Iowa 2 years before, wrote that the baby must be beautiful and delighted. She can't be less, given her parents who answered to that description themselves. And so she was, and for a little while Yates was the happiest he'd been since he first met the baby's mother. Love struck, he fussed over Gina constantly and even seemed to enjoy changing diapers and so forth. Such was his contentment that he was able to work better, though he had less time for it, while Martha installed the dark room and got on with both motherhood and photography. The baby's presence was a decided improvement. That summer, DeWitt Henry sent a somewhat worked-over transcript of their interview, and Yates was so appalled by what he'd apparently let slip while in his cups that he rewrote almost every word, including a number of the questions. Believe, he informed Henry, I have put an awful lot of work into this thing. A solid week, working damn near round the clock, neglecting everything else I was supposed to be doing. And I do feel satisfied with it now, though you may not. The project posed an interesting challenge to Yates. As he began to consider seriously what he'd so dumbly put on tape, he found himself working out certain convictions that hadn't been quite so clear in his mind before. For example, his frustration over the failure of A Special Providence had provoked a half-assed outburst against autobiographical fiction, which on sober reflection struck him as pure nonsense. In the published interview then, Yates nicely amended the matter with a detailed apologia for his own evolution from a mostly objective writer to one who'd learned the hard way that he hadn't earned the right yet to translate personal experience directly into fiction, which was not to say it couldn't be done given the proper distance and detachment. Perhaps the most ticklish issue was that of neglect, both with respect to his own reputation and certain others'. The last thing Yates wanted was to come off as a crybaby who felt he'd been treated unfairly by the literary establishment, or had the bad luck of going against the grain of egregious fashion. His original response, or rather Henry's touched-up version of it, is arguably a bit closer to Yates's true feelings on the subject than what he allowed into print, and deserves to be quoted at length. A popular writer, a writer who gains a broad and sustained contemporary audience, I guess, like any other writer wants to know he's good. And the bestseller lists and talk shows and his annual income all repay whatever faith it was that sat him down in front of his typewriter in the first place. But if he's a serious writer, that's got to come second. Much more common, and I think the case is mine, is when the good work is its own reward and you share it with as many readers as you can and it stays alive. It has some hard-won clarity and richness, some distillation of human investment that continues to claim some kind of permanent interest no matter what angles fashion may dispose new writers towards. My first book made a big popular splash, and that kind of success was intoxicating. And I was in the race, but the down that followed it was miserable. And the real success has been a quieter, more solid kind of thing. I know the book's good. It's there. It wins new readers. That level is there to be reached, and I don't need a cheering crowd to tell me that it's worth it. It would be nice to be the fashion, to be recognized for what I'm trying to do, in the sense that Mailer is, for instance. Life would be easier in a lot of ways, but the price of doing something difficult and honest, something true, as April Wheeler learned, is doing it alone. Yates cut the entire speech, which perhaps struck him as pontifical or protesting too much, though surely he believed every word of it. To Yates, writing was a lonely business. It would become more so over time, and had to be its own reward. Footnote. In the published version of his response, Ray Neglect, Yates avoided any kind of general statement, restricting himself to the facts of his own career with characteristic modesty. He admired occasional irritation that Revolutionary Road wasn't better known, but pointed out that it did quite well for a first novel. Then he blamed himself for having tinkered and brooded and fussed so long over A Special Providence and concluded, I can't honestly claim my stuff has been neglected. It's probably received just about the degree of attention it deserves. I simply haven't published enough to expect more. Not yet, anyway. A little more fame, however, would have been nice. As for the question of other neglected contemporaries in the realistic tradition, Henry had originally suggested three: Edward Wallant, Brian Moore, and Evan Connell. Yeats agreed they were neglected after a fashion, but for very different reasons, e.g., Wallant because of his early death, and hence in revision he made a separate qualified case for each. And then, as he wrote Henry, once I got started I couldn't stop. There are simply too goddamn many neglected contemporary writers, and I felt I had to mention at least a few of them. The few: Anatole Broyard, Gina Beralt, R.V. Cassell, George Garrett, Seymour Epstein, Fred Chappell, Helen Hudson, Howard Hoagland, George Cuomo, Arthur Roth, Andre D., James Crumley, Mark Dintenfass, Theodore Wessner, and so on and on. Mostly friends or students, but still writers whose work Yeats admired and whose careers he was loath not to boost when given the chance. Anyway, Yeats's letter to Henry continued. That got me started on the making of still another damn list. A list of traditional realistic writers who haven't been neglected, who have made major critical and popular reputations, and in a way that was the most maddening part of the whole damn thing. In one of my early drafts, for example, I launched into a furious splenetic diatribe against Saul Bellow, and another equally nasty assessment of J.P. Donlevy. But I tore all that stuff up in the end. I finally decided the best way to do it was simply to leave out the writers whose work I don't respect, and mention only those whose work I do. It's really a short list, as you'll see. Footnote. To wit, Styron, James Jones, Mailer, and Salinger, except for those convoluted Glass family chronicles. Also, with dire reservations in some cases, Updike, Philip Roth, Nabokov, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Gene Stafford, Peter Taylor, Flannery O'Connor, Cheever, Malamud, Bruce J. Friedman, Thomas Berger, and Joan Didion. Another diatribe that required a great deal of temperate revision was the one against the whole fucking post-realistic school, from which he felt obliged explicitly to exempt Vonnegut despite the tricky business of the nice blurb the man had provided for Revolutionary Road. So I guess some of your more small-minded readers are going to think I'm kissing his ass in return for that favor, Yeats advised Henry. And the point I'd like to make to you is that I don't give a shit if they do. Finally, he asked Henry to read this damn thing carefully and to bear in mind that my whole effort has been to make it sane, rational, and fair. It was all those things, and Yeats' pains in making it so were not in vain. A few months later, Henry walked down the street to St. Lawrence's office in order to submit his own work in progress, as well as to show a sample issue of Plowshares and the Yates interview in proof. Lawrence was impressed by how cogent and back to work his old friend seemed. The two men had been out of touch for almost 5 years. Yeats was hurt but unsurprised that Lawrence had sent no word when A Special Providence was published, in all its carefully edited sloppiness, as Yeats put it. He assumed Lawrence had given him up for dead, another washed-up author and a treacherous friend at that, and thus was very touched to hear again from Lawrence that November. I've just finished reading proofs of a very fine interview you gave to DeWitt Henry, and I could hear your voice clearly, Lawrence wrote. If for any reason you decide to change publishers, please let me know. So, who knows, said Yeats. I might still bring out a Delacorte Seymour Lawrence book and have money coming in by the bushel basketful. Meanwhile, he was still in Wichita. His writer-in-residence appointment had been renewed for another year and might indeed become permanent if he wasn't careful. By then, the idea of getting out of Kansas and going home to New York had become an obsession, and Yeats was far from particular about the means. He asked Hayes Jacobs, an old freelancer like himself, to find him an employment agent who could scout the New York job market for anything from PR to publishing to teaching to whatever, preferably on a part-time basis. Jacobs was less than sanguine, devilishly hard to place you at the price you're seeking, but put him in touch with Elise Ford at the Prudential Placement Agency. For Mrs. Ford's benefit, Yates spent much of his Thanksgiving vacation updating his resume, a 2.5-page single-spaced summary of a singularly varied career. Its subject, a freelance writer, was an NBA-nominated author of 3 books who'd received several major grants, served as sole speechwriter for Robert F. Kennedy, written screenplays for John Frankenheimer and Roger Corman, and published short stories in numerous anthologies in major magazines, though not, alas, The New Yorker. Along the way, he'd also written for Food Field Reporter, Trade Union Courier, UPI, Johnson & Johnson, and of course Remington Rand, about which he spilled the most resume ink of all, detailing his various duties on behalf of the UNIVAC. And last but hardly least, he taught at 4 universities, and his list of references included Styron, Vonnegut, Kissel, Kazin, Borgelli, and Dr. Frank Castor at Wichita State University. This is my present position. Such a resume would seem to suggest an eminently can-do kind of guy, but amid what Jacobs called the big nothing of the New York job market, the only initial nibble it elicited was from the N.W. Ayer & Son Incorporated, who thought they might be able to get Yates an occasional PR assignment concerning the U.S. Army's second centennial. The academic world was even more categorical in its rejection. Hostos Community College was willing to interview Yates but wouldn't pay travel expenses, while Sarah Lawrence, Rutgers, Queensborough Community College, Rider College, Princeton, Wellesley, Skidmore, and SUNY at Stony Brook, just to mention the few that favored Yates with a reply, had no openings at the time. As a kind of dismal postscript, Yates's old New York friend Arthur Roth wrote in January that his last 2 novels had been rejected, a lot of commitment down the drain, and for the past 9 months he'd been working as a carpenter's helper. I often wonder how you are doing and how life is treating you, Roth remarked. At the moment, Yates was of the opinion that life was treating him poorly. Perhaps it's a favor to Sam Lawrence, with whom McCall was tentatively negotiating a contract for disturbing the piece. Yates agreed to review a Delacorte novel for the New York Times Book Review, something called The Morning After by Jack B. Weiner. All Yates knew at the outset was that the book was about a drunk, and by the time he finished it, Yates was a drunk again too. Martha never quite understood the coincidence. The fact that he'd review such a book gave me the creeps, she said, and afterward he seemed to make the decision to give up. The book seemed to remind him that drinking was something he could do. The book also made him aware of the fact that a Delacorte author had just published a novel almost exactly like the one Yates himself had been writing for 3 years. 90% of Yates's Times review is a dogged plot summary, as if he were bemusedly enumerating all the ways in which Weiner's book resembled his own. The alcoholic protagonist, Charlie Lester, is a PR man who's cynical about his work. He decides to consult a vain, supercilious psychiatrist who appears to doze through Charlie's hapless monologues. After a few sessions, Charlie quits the man cold and goes on a vacation to dry out, but ends up screaming drunken obscenities to his wife on the phone. He makes his 10-year-old son feel so unhappy and embarrassed that all the boy can muster is a mumbled fine or okay or no. The constant refrain of John Wilder's son is, I don't know, I don't care, and so on. Toward the end of his review, Yates pointed out a few flaws such as Weiner's dreadful images. For example, the surf rolls in as if to the slow rhythmic beat of a giant salt-encrusted metronome, but then manfully calls it a compelling piece of work. Charlie Lester's real problem is the agony of his total isolation, and it comes to serve as an eloquent, unforgettable metaphor for the secret loneliness in us all. A very Yatesian theme, that, and an apt description of Wilder's and Yates's real problem as well. So began what might arguably be called the worst year or 2 of Yates's life, which of course is no mean assertion. He started drinking during the day, Martha remembered. One of his students was a big drinker, and the 2 of them would get drunk a lot until 3 a.m. or so. I hated it. In despair over his novel, to say nothing of life in general, the steady drumbeat of rejection coming his way from New York, Yates tried writing a short story for the first time in 10 years, titled Forms of Entertainment. It was promptly rejected by the New Yorker and the editor Gordon Lish at Esquire, who solicited work from Yates as soon as he arrived at the magazine a few years before. Monica McCall reported that Lish was putting the story through, that is, sending it upstairs to editor-in-chief Harold Hayes for confirmation of purchase, which does not necessarily mean a firm acceptance, because apparently Hayes could turn it down. Yates was frantic enough to call Lish on the phone, which resulted in the following note: Dick, I'm doing all that can be done. Trust me. But for God's sake, man, keep this thing in perspective. A few days later, the story was officially rejected. As Lish recalled the episode, I wanted to get Dick into Esquire because I felt bad for him and wanted to do something for him. He was so miserable that I extended myself. But the truth was that Forms of Entertainment had never made it past the magazine's associate editors, and Lish, in defiance of his better judgment, had tried but failed to change their minds about it. Yates responded to this latest rejection by calling Lish on the phone and abusively accusing him of favoring only name writers. Finally, he threatened to get on a plane and shoot Lish. Dick was unappeasable, shouting, Lish remembered. His wife was screaming in the background, "Don't pay attention, he's drunk, he's drunk." Afterwards, she called me to apologize. The next day, Lish wrote Yates a letter. Your performance was an appalling piece of self-destruction. How absurd to make an enemy of me and of Esquire. Your calls, your letters, the whole matter of your offering of forms and your response to the rejection is ugly and sad. Your rage should be directed elsewhere. If you had the maturity of your years, you'd see this. And as for your threats of violence, come ahead, old buddy. You'll find me as passionate in this as in friendship. It would take almost 3 years for a somewhat recovered Yates to apologize. Meanwhile, he decided not to submit Forms of Entertainment elsewhere, and the manuscript doesn't survive. It was a Jekyll and Hyde thing, Martha said of her husband's abrupt decline. It was like something clicked in his brain. Suddenly, he wasn't there anymore. He was irrational, drunk all the time, and it was willful, in-your-face drinking, consumed with self-loathing over his work and desperately anxious about the future. Yates began to suspect that the world was conspiring against him. Shortly after the Esquire conference, he called Siren and held the man captive for some 2 hours while he railed against all the people who'd let him down. Friends, family, Hollywood people, Iowa people, on and on and on. Soon Martha became the enemy, particularly when Yates discovered a paperback on alcoholism she'd recently purchased and stashed in a drawer. He hit the ceiling, she recalled, furious. I couldn't deny it was to read about him. It was the first time by default I'd confronted him that I thought he was an alcoholic. Many endless conversations followed, the long lesson in futility that Sheila had learned so thoroughly more than a decade before. As ever, Yates proved an adept, indefatigable arguer and would never concede that he was an alcoholic. The word enraged him. Whoever used it didn't understand where the real problem lay. Into this nightmare came his daughter Monica, who for 15 years had somehow been spared the knowledge of her father's mental problems. This time he was too far gone to pull himself together for her visit, though during the daytime at least he was sober if morose. But night after night she'd hear him pacing the hours away and hissing abuse at his wife, the word bitch recurring every so often amid the general mutter. One morning she found Martha sitting in the kitchen weeping. Why is he being so mean? Monica asked. And the hollow-eyed woman said he had a drinking problem. By then, Martha herself was so depressed that she'd stopped doing housework, and Monica tried to cheer things up by mopping floors and taking care of the baby. But mostly she stayed away on her bicycle, and when she returned to Mahopac, she asked her mother about Yates's problem. Sheila had made it a point never to malign her ex-husband to the children. though she always spoke badly of him later, Monica points out. But this time she calmly explained that, yes, he was an alcoholic. I am your daughter and I love you, Monica wrote her father, and I hereby order you to be no longer depressed or sad or feeling blue. When you finish reading this, I want you to go look at your neato wife and your little cute daughter and think of your two big daughters and be overjoyed. But Yates was almost beyond noticing his wife and daughter, much less deriving comfort from them. As Martha put it, he was so self-absorbed by then he couldn't part the curtains of his own problems and relate to the world. Determined to confront him with indisputable proof of his sickness, and also perhaps to have something to show a doctor when the time came, Martha prepared a list of symptoms that gives a vivid idea of what it was like to live with Yates at his worst, and why it was sometimes difficult to make a proper distinction between alcoholism and mental illness. According to the memo, Yates had taken to spooking around the house in his underwear. Usually fanatic about body exposed, Martha noted, skinny legs, etc. And sometimes standing still for long intervals, obliviously as if in deep concentration. He was now smoking constantly and inhaling deeply, though all the while he was obsessed with the fear of death from lung cancer or heart disease. Like his idol Fitzgerald, he made constant lists in very emphatic script while talking to self in constant whispering extreme. Sometimes curiosity was such that he became convinced he had an urgent message to the world and was on the verge of something big. But perhaps the most definitive symptom was an agitated inability to communicate, to understand and make himself understood amid the depths of his own bewildered dread. As Martha wrote, mostly quiet and brooding, but when gets to talking easily, worked up into panicky declarations. I hate psychiatrists. What do you know? They do watch what you're wearing. Increasingly jumpy to be asked simple question while working or charged with simple tasks or putting something on calendar, e.g. breakfast is ready. God damn it. Time, calendar, and clock, great source of consternation, confusion, and panic. Simple phrases and cliches are not understood for their common meaning, e.g., which Saturday is this Saturday? It could be any in the year. Recurring conversation, D. Martha, M. What, honey? D. Oh, nothing. Recurring, I'll be okay just as soon as. Don't go away. How am I doing? I'm all right. Who says I'm crazy? Then a hug. How could you love a crazy man? What's going to become of me? As time passes, more and more fearful of hospitalization or being doped up and brought down too far, a legitimate fear, and more suspect of my motives. You think I'm crazy. You don't understand. The more Martha begged him to get help, the more sarcastic and spitefully drunken he became. And though he was wholly dependent on her, don't go away, he seemed unmoved by the distress he caused with such obnoxious behavior. When she finally lost her temper and flew at him with her fists, the inebriated Yates seemed to enjoy the spectacle, holding her off and laughing. After a while, she gave up. I remember sitting on the couch, she said, holding Gina, my tears falling on her and Dick yelling at me. It was so senseless it sticks in my head. What's wrong with this picture? Since she didn't argue anymore, Yates seemed to assume he'd finally brought her around to his point of view, namely that he didn't need help, that all would be well as soon as certain enigmatic factors fell into place. In fact, she'd made a cool-headed, deliberate decision. She'd do whatever was necessary to help him get back to New York. I felt responsible for Wichita, then wait a year or so for him to be lucid enough to fend for himself. Then she'd take the baby and leave. By the time Yates' luck changed, he was no... Okay, I can do it. By the time Yates' luck changed, he was in no condition to enjoy it. His red letter day was March 21st, 1973, when he was offered a part-time position at Columbia, beginning with the spring 1974 semester. Far more importantly, a lucrative deal by Yates' standard, standards was finalized that same day with Sam Lawrence, who offered a $50,000 advance for disturbing the peace. At the time, Yates was too relieved to be bothered much by the somewhat eccentric method of payment, which would persist for the rest of their association. He was to receive $12,000 on signing and then equal monthly payments of $1,500 until he delivered the manuscript on July 1st, 1974, whereupon he'd receive the balance of $20,000. Or rather, he'd receive $10,000 for delivery and another $10,000 when the book was published. The idea was to provide a steady long-term income for an unpredictable man. Those monthly payments were a kind of salary, Lawrence proudly observed, and they sustained him. They also signaled the beginning of an even more ambivalent phase of the friendship. When sane and solvent, Yates was mostly grateful for Lawrence's belief in him as a writer, for his financial as well as moral support. "How much do you need, Dick?" Lawrence had said when Yates complained of his Wichita predicament. It was true that he thought Lawrence a bit pompous, but, as he wrote a friend, "At his best, he's a solid man with good instincts. Moreover, he'll never try to fuck around with your manuscripts, as many editors do. He's never asked me to change a word." After the carefully edited sloppiness of Knopf, Yates had decided that Lawrence's laissez-faire approach was a virtue after all. As for the man's good instincts, he found favor with Yates by turning down such novels as The World According to Garp. On the other hand, Yates noted, he's an enthusiastic supporter of Richard Brautigan, so what the hell are we going to do? Lawrence's view of Yates, meanwhile, was characterized by a kind of complicated magnanimity. I can never say this word. Magnanimity. A mixture of admiration and concern, as their mutual friend Dan Wakefield put it. It was the concern part that rankled. Concern meant that he was mawkishly aware of Yates's failings, his drinking and instability and general incapacity to care for himself. Lawrence, too, was a heavy drinker and rather strange man in his own right, but he was also prosperous and proprietary toward his authors. What he demanded implicitly in return for his largesse was that they do their work and show a seemly gratitude, a sentiment Yates sometimes felt and sometimes didn't. Lawrence's later eulogy of his old friend, while touching in parts, reads almost like a litany of unacknowledged favors, as it's largely comprised of data relating to their various contracts. "Dad would have hated that eulogy," said Monica Yates. "Lawrence went on and on about the money. That was a love-hate relationship, big time." Another aspect of Lawrence's concern that bothered Yates was the fact that it was mostly transmitted at arm's length, usually in the form of a check. All the more so later, when Lawrence seemed unwilling to soil himself with Yates's difficult life. Yates would mimic him bitterly. "Don't mix business with pleasure," or so Lawrence liked to tell Yates, though the former's social life was acutely consumed by business with and on behalf of his authors. Yates was always angry at Lawrence, said psychiatrist Winthrop Burr, but at the same time he wanted to be more accepted by him. For a while, though, it sufficed that Lawrence had rescued him from Wichita, and Yates lost no time traveling to New York alone to find an apartment. Needless to say, he was in no shape for such a trip, which would serve as a bleak foreshadowing of the move to come. Perhaps the first blow was his discovery that he couldn't afford to live in Manhattan after all. He'd have to settle for one of the outer boroughs, which to Yates was only a slight step up from Kansas. For that and any number of other reasons, he began drinking even harder than before, which provoked a fresh and frightening symptom of advanced alcoholism: epileptic seizures. His first attack took place at Bill Riordan's apartment in the Village, and later that day he had another in Jerry Schulman's car, while the latter drove him to Staten Island to view an apartment. Yates, already drunk and semi-deranged when Schulman arrived to pick him up, began thrashing and frothing at the mouth while they passed through the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, then tried to jump out of the car. Schulman had to hold the writhing man in place until they could turn around. After a phone call to Nathan S. Klein, Yates thought he was calm enough to make the trip back to Staten Island. But once they arrived, he had another seizure, this time in the presence of his prospective landlord. As his convulsions subsided, he tried to stand up and tripped on a toy car, which, according to Schulman, prompted a stream of hideous invective. The landlord proved remarkably sympathetic, no doubt mollified by the relative sanity of Yates's companion. He agreed to rent the apartment to this disturbed man, perhaps on the theory that he was having a bad day. It continued badly. Schulman drove his friend to the airport, where Yates began to have second thoughts about catching his flight. It was late, he felt lousy, and besides, he usually called Monica at this time of day. When Schulman offered to take Yates to a hospital, Yates became indignant. "Don't tell me what to do," he shouted, and staggered off to find a phone. Schulman, meanwhile, called Martha in Kansas and asked her advice. With a baby screaming in the background, she mentioned a number of pills her husband should take and urged Schulman to get him on the plane no matter what. When the exhausted man tried to do as he was told, Yates exploded, as if mortally offended by his friend's presumption. "It was humiliating to be with him," said Schulman. "After that, I realized you couldn't do the right thing for Dick because he'd always insist on taking care of himself." The episode officially killed whatever was left of Yates's friendship with the Schulmans. Grace had been drifting away for some time. Apart from a general exasperation with Yates, her life had simply settled in such a way that commotion makers were no longer welcome. She was a professor at Baruch College as well as poetry editor of The Nation and director of the 92nd Street Y Pottery Center. Also, she was sick of literary people who exploited her husband's good nature. "Often I had to be the heavy in protecting Jerry from what I felt to be insulting responses to him for his kindness," she said. "And when I heard about his patience with Dick that day, I thought, enough of Dick's bad behavior. As for Jerry, he accepted a last goodwill invitation to dine with the Yateses in Staten Island. But the evening was awkward, and neither man made an effort to contact the other again." By the time they moved to New York in June, Yates was a total wreck, as Martha put it. Even he himself admitted a month after their arrival that he'd become such a wallowing whiskey head, not to be confused with alcoholic, that he could barely hold a pencil straight. As ever, his drinking both worsened and commingled with the vagaries of mental illness, such that it was impossible to predict what he would do or say next. Shortly before leaving Kansas, he'd invited his daughter Sharon to come take his car off his hands, as long as she agreed to arrange such matters as insurance and title transfer. After she'd done so, she called from Iowa to apprise him of her progress. "Okay, I got the insurances. Now we have to..." And Yates blew up. "What do you think I am? Some sort of Jewish father?" Sharon didn't know what to make of this. Certainly the ethnic slur was uncharacteristic. Was he angry because she'd called about practical affairs and hadn't attended to the proper daughterly preliminaries? The apartment in Staten Island was still being painted when they arrived, so they spent a few days at the Americana Hotel near Times Square. Yates checked in with Dr. Klein, who prescribed the anticonvulsant drug Dilantin, and strongly urged Yates to stop drinking. Probably during this visit, too, Klein prescribed or re-prescribed antabuse, which Yates took sporadically, if at all. His private compromise was to give up whiskey and drink only beer, and his relative initial sobriety had the usual depressive effect. When his Iowa friend Jody Lowndes visited him at the hotel, Yates wanted to talk about the death of his former teaching colleague Richard Gaiman. Gaiman, called King of the Freelancers because of his mammoth output, had rated a very brief photoless obituary in the Times. 3,000 articles and over a dozen books, Yates sighed, and they give him 5 inches for his obituary. I'll be lucky to get 2. Footnote, Yates received almost 10 inches and a photo. Lowndes recalled that the whole matter seemed to trouble him tremendously, and Martha agreed. Yates's indifference toward fame, she always felt, was deceptive. Dick had to be recognized for his talent to be one of the literary elite. Anything else amounted to failure. A good marriage and child should have been enough, but it wasn't. Granted that he could scarcely get worse, Yates showed a few signs of improvement in New York. Staten Island wasn't so bad after all. Their apartment was a cramped two-bedroom on the seventh floor of a drab modern building, but it had a view of sorts and was nice enough by Yates's standards. All the places where he lived with Martha were nicer than other apartments in his life, Monica pointed out. He'd always enjoyed crossing on the ferry, and now that he didn't have to bother with a day job for a while, he spent leisurely afternoons walking around Manhattan and seeing a few leftover friends. He visited Bill Riordan and John Williams and was gratified to find that Vonnegut was taking his enormous success very gracefully, and had even promised to come slumming in Staten Island with his new girlfriend, Jill Crements, an ultra-fashionable young photographer. But mostly Yates kept to himself. He was bemused by what he found in the city after his 9-year exile and noted a certain Rip Van Winkle quality to his prowlings in Manhattan. As he wrote his friend Geoffrey Clark, "Christ, how things have changed. The Empire State Building is no longer the tallest in the world. The whole West Side is swarming with guys who look as if they've got switchblades in one pocket and hypodermic syringes in the other. The whole village is a morass of cruising fags and teeny boppers. All the good restaurants and bars have become tourist traps, and all the taxi cabs have plastic or wire mesh partitions to keep the passengers from garroting the drivers. But it's home, and I guess I'll get used to it." But he never quite did. Like his character Emily Grimes, Yates had begun to live in memories all the time, and New York was haunted by too many ghosts. Friends didn't notice anything particularly amiss between the Yateses. Martha tended to be a courteous hostess, if a bit stiff and withdrawn. By then I was so radically disenchanted by the world of writers that I'd rather do anything than listen to them talk. Yates liked to mention that this was actually his second time in Staten Island, reminiscing about his 8 months in the TB ward at Halloran. Generally, too, he'd pay his wife the gentlemanly tribute of showing off her artwork on the walls. Trees and dogs, things like that, DeWitt Henry recalled, with many a lavish compliment. Toward Gina, he seemed clumsy and devoted, said Mark Denton-Fass. He was almost afraid to hold her because he thought he might drop her. One night, the family bumped into Bob Reich and his wife at a Broadway show. The last time Yates and his old friend ever laid eyes on each other, and the Reiches cooed appropriately over the somber toddler in their midst. "She's cute when she doesn't have that thing stuck in her face," said Yates, and abruptly plucked the pacifier out of his daughter's mouth. Those were the good times. Dick acted normal around friends, said Martha. He could sort of turn it on and off, but his tirades would continue as soon as they left. Yates spent most of his days anxiously taking pills, trying to write, and stalking around the apartment, shouting. It didn't matter if Martha was present. He wasn't addressing her after all. "Lish, you son of a bitch," he'd suddenly erupt, or else some ghost from a more distant past would provoke his wrath. Martha worried a little what the neighbors thought. Surely they heard, but otherwise she was used to it. Dick's tantrums were so much background noise by then, she said. If he didn't come out of it, well, I'd already decided to leave. Still, I'm amazed now that I stuck it so long. I'd come to accept things no human being should ever have to accept. Yates conserved the better part of his sanity for work. Though Martha had no idea how he managed at Columbia, he nonetheless ventured into Manhattan once a week to meet his 2-hour class and hold conferences before and after. His novel was a little behind schedule, but not much, and Sam Lawrence was so overwhelmed by the first 122 pages that he urged him not to rush. What's most important is to have the book right. One night, the publisher came out to Staten Island for dinner, and Martha bought a special antique chair for the occasion and cooked a sole with cream sauce and mashed potatoes. Otherwise, she might have been invisible. Lawrence commended her for putting rolls on the table. Good, rolls. Can't possibly eat until I've had rolls. Ulcer. Then the two men commenced drinking and talking books. Yates was already thinking about his next novel, the subject of which he proposed to be a lovable Irish alcoholic who performed spontaneous tap dances. Lawrence winced. No more desperate characters, Dick. Please. Soon Yates got a better idea. Ever since A Special Providence, he'd wanted to take another shot at writing an explicitly autobiographical novel, but properly formed this time. One night it occurred to him that a nice way to objectify the me character, as Yates called it, would be to make him a woman. In order to bring it off, though, he'd need more material than his own life could provide. Dick called me out of the blue, remembered his old girlfriend Natalie Bowen. He was drunk, of course, and woke me up, but I was glad to hear from him. He said he was starting a new novel and wondered if I'd be willing to talk about my own life. Bowen was happy to tell him whatever he needed to know. As Yates was already somewhat aware, she'd led just the kind of independent and rather lonely life he had in mind for his character. She'd been married briefly to a man who told her he hated her body, referring mainly to her flat chest. She'd had 2 abortions in the 50s. She'd lived in a high, spacious apartment near Gramercy Park where somebody had penciled a long, thick penis on one of the wallpaper horses in the hallway. And as her drinking got worse, she would occasionally wake up with strange men in her bed. For a while, she'd collected unemployment and stayed drunk all day, until finally she went to the Payne Whitney walk-in mental health clinic and started seeing a psychiatrist. Yates was delighted and invited Bowen to come out for dinner and meet his wife. He may or may not have had ulterior motives for exposing Martha to this partial model for the embryonic Emily Grimes. Original liberated woman, as her nephew Peter remarks with unwitting irony in the novel. That such liberation leads, if only for a while in Bowen's case, to promiscuity, poverty, and despair was a point Yates would have been eager to impress on Martha, who had begun to intimate her plans for leaving him. Largely to spare his feelings, she'd spoken in rather vague terms about wanting to find herself, and Yates concluded that she'd become a women's living bitch, as he sometimes put it. He couldn't speak calmly on the subject, partly perhaps because his mother's independence had caused him so much grief. Yates's hatred for all feminist horseshit bordered on the pathological. As usual in such matters, he found a sympathetic ally in Andre D., whose own marriage was breaking up around the same time. Trouble with me and my friends, he wrote Yates, is we're married to women who are making the transition between the old type woman and the new type, and we're getting the best of neither and the worst of both. In fact, Martha was not at all active in the movement, though its ubiquity could hardly fail to affect her state of mind, as might be surmised by a letter she wrote Yates almost 3 years later. Women have been oblique, mysterious, evasive out of fear of telling the truth. Fear of hurting the vulnerable emotions of a man, fear of being scorned or laughed at, and out of shame. I made for myself a perfect trap out of my inability to speak, and the longer I went taking my self-definition from you, the less you knew me. At the time, though, she tried to avoid discussing such notions with him. I didn't want to throw kerosene on the fire, but it was typical of Yates to blame his wife's disaffection on a pernicious ideology as he saw it rather than his own behavior. She left him that spring. Yates would later tell friends that A Natural Girl was a wholly autobiographical account of their breakup. And while Martha dismisses the story as a crock, much of what her fictional alter ego tells the devastated David Clark rings true. We haven't been all right for a long time, and we aren't all right now, and it isn't going to get any better. I'm sorry if this comes as a surprise, but it really shouldn't. And it wouldn't if you'd ever known me as well as you think you do. It's over. That's all. I'm leaving. You don't love me anymore. That's right, she said exactly. I don't love you anymore. By then, Martha was apt to say all those things, and indeed, Yates was shocked when the time came. Though as the wife in the story points out, he shouldn't have been. Martha's decision was hardly the bombshell hurled by the morbidly callous Susan Andrews. She'd spent almost a year preparing him for her departure. He was too out of it to remember from one day to the next, and when she finally told him the time had arrived, Yates drew the same conclusion as 15 years before. Martha's inability to love, like Sheila's, was a manifestation of insanity. He made an appointment with Nathan S. Klein for all 3 of them, baby 2, and at length the exasperated Martha agreed to go. For most of the session, she was left waiting outside Klein's office with Gina on her hip, while the two men discussed the matter between them. Finally, Klein asked to see Martha alone. So, he said, you're pretty determined to leave. Yes. Tell me one thing, he continued. I want you to think about this really carefully. Has your primary feeling for Dick always been pity? Yes. That's all I need to hear, said Klein, and rather contemptuously dismissed her. She was then handed over to a psychologist next door. Klein was just a pill pusher, she remarked, not a talk psychiatrist, who gave her a book with some such title as On Becoming a Human Being. I almost threw it at him, said Martha. Probably the guy was just trying to be helpful, but the book had an unfortunate title. Both Klein and the second man seemed to read the anger on Martha's face and realized that there was no point in going on. They were quite right. I resented being left out of the whole process of Dick's treatment until then. Nobody had ever asked me anything, and I was the person who had to live with him. The actual leaving proved a protracted, problematic business. Martha had tried to go at least once while Yates was ranting at her, but realized she didn't have the means. No money, no friends to speak of outside of the marriage, and her family knew nothing of the whole business. Finally, on a day when Yates had gone into the city to teach, she worked up the nerve to call her parents and tell them everything. It came out between sobs, and they arranged to send a plane ticket and money. When Yates returned that afternoon, Martha told him she was going home for a month to think things out. Dick called me a lot in Kansas, she remembered, and he was still verbally abusive, even though he wanted me to stay. He didn't have the sense to realize he was making matters worse. When bullying failed to have the desired effect, he began to plead. He'd stop drinking and try to be nicer and so on, but it was no use. Martha wanted an immediate separation and had already made plans to move to Washington, D.C. for Montessori teacher training. Back in Staten Island, the couple divided their belongings into two separate moving vans. Yates could now afford to live in Manhattan. He was so vividly crestfallen that several of their neighbors asked him what the problem was. The problem, he might have reflected, a la Michael Davenport, is that my wife is leaving me, and I think it's going to drive me crazy.